There is a quote that has been sitting on the desk of every Chinese strategic planner for the last 3 months. It did not come from Beijing. It did not come from Tehran. It came from Napoleon Bonaparte. And last week, The Economist put it on its front cover, above a photograph of Xi Jinping watching Donald Trump from across a room. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. On May 13, 2026, Donald Trump landed in Beijing. He had traveled 9,500 miles, the full width of the planet, to ask the leader of China for help ending a war that has now cost the United States $29 billion and is still not over. He brought Tim Cook, he brought Elon Musk, he brought the false heater of American economic power as a display of leverage, and Xi Jinping received him with a state banquet, a tour of the Temple of Heaven, and 7 words that committed China to absolutely nothing. If I can be of any help at all, Trump flew home 48 hours later and posted 2 words on social media about the Iran military campaign. To be continued. The ceasefire that Pakistan brokered on April 8th, the one Trump called a favor to other nations, the one he described as being on massive life support, is still breathing, barely. And the Manwo just watched the American president cross the planet to ask for his assistance, returned to Sisyphus having given nothing, conceded nothing, and gained everything. This is not a story about diplomacy failing. This is a story about a trap that was never meant to be escaped. And Xi Jinping did not build it last week. He has been building it for 3 months. Let me show you exactly how it works. To understand what Xi just did, you need to understand what this war actually is, and what it has cost the country fighting it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of strikes against Iran. The stated objectives shifted depending on which official was speaking: destroying Iran's nuclear program, ending its ballistic missile capability, forcing regime change, securing the Strait of Hormuz. What the strikes actually produced was this: Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated in the opening hours. Iran's conventional military was severely degraded, and Iran did the one thing its entire strategic doctrine had always reserved as the weapon of last resort. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's seaborne oil, 30% of global liquefied natural gas, all of it stopped. Fuel shortages rippled through parts of Asia within weeks. Oil prices climbed nearly $20 above pre-war levels. The global economy began absorbing a shock, whose full consequence is still unfolding. A ceasefire brokered by Pakistan took effect on April 8, 2026, producing the highest level direct engagement between the United States and Iran since the 1979 revolution. US Vice President Vance sat across from Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf in Islamabad. Those talks failed. The United States responded by launching a naval blockade of Iranian ports on April 13th. Iran responded by closing the strait again. A dual blockade. America blockading Iran. Iran blockading the world, settled into the grinding standoff that exists today. And sitting above all of it, watching, calculating, and doing precisely nothing that costs Beijing anything, was China. There are 3 actors in this story whose interests you need to hold in your mind simultaneously, because the trap only becomes visible when you see all 3 at once. The United States needs this war to end on terms that include Iran surrendering its 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Those are Trump's coordinates. Without them, there is no deal he can sell domestically. Without the strait reopening, oil prices stay elevated. American consumers keep paying the economic cost of the war, and the $29 billion price tag keeps climbing at roughly $4 billion every 2 weeks. Iran needs the opposite sequencing. Tehran's counter-proposal demanded that the US recognize Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and pay war reparations before any nuclear discussions even begin. Trump called that proposal totally unacceptable. Iran's foreign minister then announced that uranium enrichment is not currently on the agenda of negotiations. Two sides whose core demands are not just incompatible, they are sequentially inverted dots. And then there is China. Beijing purchases an estimated 80 to 90% of Iran's sanctioned oil exports. Every barrel Iran sells, despite the blockade, flows to a Chinese refinery. That purchasing relations is the financial lifeline, keeping Iran's economy from collapsing. China has the single most powerful lever available to pressure Iran into a deal, and China has chosen, with complete deliberates, not to pull it. Not because Beijing cannot, because Beijing has calculated that not pulling it is worth more. Here is the calculation that Beijing does not need to say out loud, because it is visible in every decision it has made since February 28th. Every day the United States remains militarily committed in the Middle East is a day American carrier strike groups are not patrolling the Taiwan Strait. Every intelligence asset tracking Iranian missile launches is one fewer asset monitoring Chinese military movements in the South China Sea. Every diplomatic hour spent on Pakistan-mediated Iran ceasefire talks is an hour not spent building the Pacific Alliance architecture that contains Chinese expansion. Every munition expended over Iranian targets is a munition that cannot be immediately replaced. And the US will need rare earth minerals from China to rebuild its depleted missile interceptor stockpiles, minerals that China controls. The war in Iran has given Xi Jinping sources of leverage he could not have anticipated having at start of this year. That is not an analytical opinion. That is the assessment of Ali Wine of the International Crisis Group, stated publicly as Trump's plane was landing in Beijing. The Iran war transformed the strategic relationship between Washington and Beijing in China's favor, without Beijing firing a shot, spending $1, or making a single commitment it did not want to make. And it gets more specific than that. The US will need to replenish its missile interceptor stocks depleted by the Iran campaign. The components for those interceptors require rare earth processing that China dominates globally. Trump arrived in Beijing needing a favor on Iran. He left needing a favor on rare earths as well. The leverage column is not equal. It has never been equal. And the Beijing summit did not rebalance it. Now read what the Beijing summit actually produced. Not what Trump said about it on Air Fortune, but what the documented record shows. Trump arrived with a delegation that included Tim Cook and Elon Musk. 2 days of bilateral meetings at the Great Hall of the People. A state banquet. A tour of Zhongnanai. Trump called it a 12 out of 10. China's deliverables. A statement that there is no point in continuing this conflict. A foreign ministry spokesperson saying dialogue and negotiation is the right way forward. A confirmation from Xi that he would like to be of help. And a framework agreement for a constructive NE-US relationship of strategic stability for the next 3 years. Read those outputs carefully. None of them commit China to a single concrete action on Iran. None of them include a timeline. None of them include a mechanism. None of them include a consequence if China does nothing. She ruled out sending military assistance to Iran, which was never on the table, and offered diplomatic help, which costs nothing to offer and has no enforcement attached to it. Trump said he is not asking for any favors, because when you ask for favors, you have to do favors in return. That sentence, delivered on Air Force One heading home, is the tell. The phrase "we may have to do a little cleanup work about resuming military operations" is not the language of a president returning from a diplomatic breakthrough. It is the language of a president who came home with less than he needed. Here is the angle nobody in mainstream coverage is framing correctly, because the story is not Thatcher refused to help. The story is that China has engineered a position where helping the United States is strategically inferior to watching it struggle. Think about what Beijing would have to sacrifice to genuinely pressure Iran into a deal. It would have to threaten to cut Iranian oil purchases, reducing a revenue stream it currently receives at a significant discount to global market prices. It would have to take a public position against a country it has been defending at the UN Security Council 4 months. It would have to hand Washington a diplomatic victory in a conflict that the rest of the non-Western world is watching as a test of whether American military power can still dictate outcomes. And it would have to do all of that in exchange for what exactly? Trump said himself, he's not offering favors. The Economist's Napoleon cover is not editorial commentary. It is strategic diagnosis. She is not an ally of Iran in any formal sense. He is not ideologically committed to Tehran's survival. He is committed to one thing: China's strategic position relative to the United States. And right now, every week the Iran war continues improves that position. That is not neutrality. That is the most sophisticated form of strategic competition available. Winning by refusing to play on your opponent's timeline, on your opponent's terms, in your opponent's chosen theater. So where does this leave the ceasefire? And what does to be continued actually mean? The ceasefire brokered by Pakistan on April 8th has already survived longer than most analysts expected, but its terms remain unresolved. The Strait of Hormuz is still effectively closed to normal commercial traffic. The US naval blockade of Iranian ports is still in effect. Both sides have fired on each other inside the strait since the ceasefire took effect. Iran's latest counter-proposal was rejected by Trump as totally unacceptable, and some of Trump's own aides are now more seriously considering resuming major combat operations than at any point in the last several weeks. The negotiating deadlock is structural, not accidental. Iran wants sanctions lifted before nuclear concessions. The US wants nuclear concessions before sanctions relief. Those positions cannot be reconciled by a ceasefire extension. They can only be reconciled by one side moving, and neither side has moved. The decision is binary. A deal that gives Iran enough on sanctions to justify nuclear concessions, which Israel has already signaled it would view as an incomplete outcome, or a resumption of military operations. There is no third option that the current negotiating architecture supports. And Xi knows it, which is why he smiled, said 7 words, and went back to his desk. Let's put the consequence map on the table, because the second-order effects of China's non-move are already visible. For the United States, the war cost $25 billion 2 weeks ago. It costs $29 billion today. That is $4 billion in 14 days, roughly $285 million per day. With no deal in sight and a ceasefire on life support, the missile interceptor stockpiles depleted by the campaign are rare earth components China controls. Israel has already signaled it wants to reduce US military support to zero, meaning Washington may be absorbing the full cost of a war whose primary region al-Banefri is now looking to cut the financial cord. For China, oil at a discount, Iran dependent on Beijing's economic lifeline for survival, a post-war construction relationship being built in real time, leverage over the US missile industrial base through rare earth supply chains, and a demonstration visible to every country in the global south that Chinese partnership offers protection from American military pressure. For Iran, survival. For now, as long as China keeps buying oil, Tehran does not face the kind of economic collapse that forces strategic capitulation. The asymmetry is not subtle. One side is paying $285 million a day. The other side is collecting distant oil. Here is the realistic outcome architecture for the next 30 to 90 days. Scenario 1. Trump resumes military operations. To be continued becomes operational. This resolves the ceasefire ambiguity, but does not resolve the strategic deadlock. Iran's enriched uranium is still in hardened storage. China still buys Iranian oil, and the cost counter keeps running. Scenario 2. A partial deal emerges. Iran makes a limited nuclear concession. The US partially fifths sanctions. The strait reopens to commercial traffic. This is the scenario Israel has already indicated it would view as incomplete, and the one Iran has publicly stated is its preferred second sync. Scenario 3. The ceasefire holds indefinitely while neither side moves. The $285 million daily cost continues. American political tolerance for extended Middle East commitment begins to erode. This is the scenario that most benefits China. The wild card in all three scenarios is what Iran's fragmented command structure decides to do next. Without a unified leadership capable of executing the strategic judgment, the moment requires the death of Khamenei and the appointment of his son as successor has created a leadership structure whose internal coherence is genuinely uncertain. Napoleon said, "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." Xi Jinping did not interrupt. He hosted, he smiled. He offered 7 words. He sent Trump home, or a plane, with a 12 out of 10 meeting and a war that is still to be continued. The trap was never about Iran. Iran is the terrain. The trap is about who gets exhausted first, and who is positioned to define what comes after. The United States is spending $285 million a day to hold a position whose endgame requires either a deal Iran will not accept on America's terms or a military resumption whose course China does not pay. America is running out of time, money, and political will. China has all three. The question is not whether Xi outplayed Trump in Beijing. The record shows he did, by doing exactly nothing. The question is what Trump does next, and whether to be continued means a deal that ends this on terms America can accept, or another phase of a conflict whose costs keep climbing, while the man who benefits most watches from 9,500 miles away and smiles. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you think Trump resumes the bombing, or does a partial deal emerge in the next 30 days? Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because when this ceasefire breaks in either direction, it will move faster than any headline can track.